Picture this. You are a fish, a specific fish, a largemouth bass, or a bluegill, or a native trout, living in a lake in the American Southeast that your lineage has occupied for millions of years. The ecosystem around you is finely calibrated. Every organism in this lake has a role. Every predator-prey relationship has been tested across geological time. Every population is held in check by something else in the system. It is not a peaceful existence. You are both predator and prey in an environment that is constantly negotiating its own balance. But it is a stable one. The system works. And then one day, something enters the water that was not there before. Something that did not arrive through any natural process of range expansion or evolutionary dispersal. Something that arrived because a person thought it would be interesting to release it, or because it escaped from an aquarium, or because it was dumped from a bait bucket, or because it was deliberately introduced by someone with intentions that seemed reasonable at the time and turned out to be catastrophically wrong. The thing that entered your lake has no natural predators here. Nothing evolved alongside it in this ecosystem. Nothing has the behavioral adaptations, the physiological responses, or the population dynamics to keep it in check. It reproduces faster than the ecosystem can absorb. It eats things that nothing else in the lake eats with the same efficiency. It occupies space and resources in ways that the existing community of organisms has no answer for. And over the following years, then decades, the lake that worked for millions of years starts to not work. Species that were here before the intruder disappear or collapse to fractions of their former populations. The calibrated system that geological time produced becomes something simpler, less diverse, and less stable. You, the native fish, are part of a story that is playing out in some version on every continent, in every ocean, in every ecosystem on Earth, where human movement has carried species beyond the boundaries that geography once enforced. The story of invasive species is one of the most significant and most consistently underestimated ecological crises currently active on the planet, and the specific animals responsible for the most damage are fascinating, infuriating, and in several cases so successful at what they do that understanding them requires respect alongside the ecological alarm. So here is the complete account: the invasive animals doing the most damage to global ecosystems right now, how they got where they are, why they are so devastating, and what their success reveals about the vulnerabilities of ecosystems that evolved without them. Start with the cane toad, because the cane toad is the case study in well-intentioned ecological catastrophe that everyone who works in conservation reaches for when they need a single example of why introducing species to solve problems is almost always a worse idea than it looks. Rhinella marina, the cane toad, is native to Central and South America, where it exists as one organism among many in ecosystems that have evolved alongside it and that contain the predators, parasites, and competitors that keep its population in check. In its native range, the cane toad is a perfectly normal component of tropical ecosystems. Unremarkable, unproblematic. In 1935, approximately 100 cane toads were released in Queensland, Australia, with the intention of controlling the cane beetle, which was damaging sugarcane crops. The logic seemed reasonable at the time. Cane toads eat beetles, cane beetles are a problem, therefore, cane toads solve the problem. The logic failed to account for several things simultaneously. Cane toads do not eat cane beetles efficiently because cane beetles spend most of their time at the tops of sugarcane plants, which cane toads do not reach. Cane toads eat essentially everything else: insects, small mammals, birds, other frogs, lizards, carrion, pet food left outside, and any other organic material they can fit in their mouths. And cane toads are toxic across their entire life cycle, carrying bufadienolide toxins in prominent parotoid glands on their shoulders that are fatal to most animals that attempt to eat them. The Australian ecosystem had no prior exposure to these toxins. The predators that would normally regulate toad populations, snakes, lizards, crocodilians, native predatory birds, had no evolved resistance to bufadienolide compounds, and no learned avoidance of the specific visual cues that mark cane toads as toxic. They ate the toads. They died. And without predator regulation, the cane toad population that began with approximately 100 individuals has expanded to an estimated 200 million animals across an enormous swath of northern and eastern Australia. The ecological damage from cane toads in Australia is multidimensional and ongoing. Native predator populations, particularly the quoll, the goanna, and several snake species, have collapsed in regions with high cane toad density, as animals that survive individual toad encounters through sublethal poisoning learn to avoid them. But populations continue to decline through ongoing mortality events. The loss of native predators creates secondary cascading effects through the prey species those predators had been regulating, producing ecosystem changes that extend well beyond the direct toad-predator interaction. The toad competes with native frog species for food and habitat, reducing native amphibian populations through direct competition in addition to the indirect effects of predator population collapse. Efforts to control cane toad populations have been sustained, creative, and largely inadequate to the scale of the problem. Physical removal programs, trapping, and community collection efforts reduce local densities temporarily without addressing the underlying population dynamics of an animal that lays up to 30,000 eggs per spawning event, and that can spawn multiple times per year. Biological control research has produced some promising directions, but deploying biological control agents in ecosystems that are already suffering from the consequences of one poorly considered species, introduction requires a level of certainty about second-order effects that is difficult to achieve quickly. Move to the brown tree snake, Boiga irregularis, because it represents a different category of invasive damage, the rapid, catastrophic, nearly total elimination of a specific taxonomic group from an entire island ecosystem. The brown tree snake is native to coastal Australia, eastern Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, where it is an arboreal predator of birds, lizards, and small mammals. It arrived on the island of Guam shortly after World War II, most likely as a stowaway in military cargo or equipment moving through Guam's wartime expanded transportation infrastructure. The date of introduction is not precisely known. The consequences are documented in devastating detail. Guam had no native land snakes before the brown tree snake arrived. The island's native bird community had evolved in the complete absence of snake predation pressure. They had no behavioral responses to snakes, no alarm calls specific to snake presence, no nesting strategies that protected eggs and chicks from arboreal predators of this type. The brown tree snake encountered a prey community that was, in the most literal sense, completely naive to its predatory approach. It could approach nesting birds at night without triggering any of the anti-predator responses that would have made hunting them difficult. It could raid nests without the adult birds having any effective defensive response. It could hunt at densities and with success rates that no prey community with evolutionary experience of it would have permitted. The result was the extinction of 12 of Guam's native forest bird species. Not decline. Not reduction to small remnant populations. Extinction. Species that had existed on Guam for millions of years, that existed nowhere else on Earth, are gone permanently because a single snake species arrived and encountered them with no evolutionary context for what was happening. The Guam rail, the Guam flycatcher, the rufous fantail, the bridled white-eye, gone. The cascade effects of losing the bird community extended into plant communities that depended on bird pollination and seed dispersal, into insect populations that the birds had been regulating, into the broader ecological function of a forest without its avian component. The brown tree snake population on Guam currently numbers in the millions. Every brown tree snake on Guam is descended from the small founding population that arrived in a cargo shipment sometime in the late 1940s. The entire catastrophe was produced by a founding population small enough to fit in a single shipping container. The lionfish, Pteroas volitans and Pteroas miles, presents an oceanic version of the invasive species catastrophe that is currently unfolding in real time across the Atlantic Ocean and Caribbean Sea. Lionfish are native to the Indo-Pacific, where they are beautiful, venomous, and regulated by the predator community they evolved within. They arrived in Atlantic and Caribbean waters through the aquarium trade, released by aquarium owners, escaped from damaged tanks during hurricanes, or simply discarded when they outgrew their tanks or their owner's interest in maintaining them. The first confirmed sightings of lionfish in Atlantic waters occurred in the 1980s. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The subsequent spread has been one of the most rapid documented expansions of any marine invasive species. Atlantic and Caribbean reef fish communities had no evolutionary exposure to lionfish predation strategies. The specific ambush hunting approach of lionfish, hovering motionless near reef structure, spreading pectoral fins to corral small fish, striking with explosive speed at ranges that prey fish had no calibrated response to, was invisible to the native reef fish community as a threat. Prey fish that would flee from predators their evolutionary history included showed no flight response to lionfish. Lionfish could hunt at close range with high success rates, in densities that the reef's fish community could not sustain. Lionfish consume an extraordinary range of reef fish species, and are capable of reducing fish populations on individual reefs by measurable percentages within months of establishment. Their reproductive capacity, females can spawn approximately 2 million eggs per year, combined with their lack of natural predators in Atlantic waters, produced population growth rates that turned early establishment events into regional population explosions within years. The ecological damage to Atlantic and Caribbean reef systems from lionfish predation is ongoing, measurable, and presents control challenges that parallel those of every other major invasive species. The scale of the problem exceeds the scale of any practical removal effort. The common carp, Cyprinus carpio, represents an invasive species whose damage is less dramatic in individual encounters and more devastating in cumulative ecosystem restructuring. Native to Asia and parts of Europe, carp were introduced to water bodies across the Americas, Australia, and other regions through a combination of deliberate aquaculture introduction and subsequent escape or release. In their native range, carp populations are regulated by predators and by the broader ecological community. In introduced ranges without equivalent regulation, carp populations expand to densities that fundamentally alter aquatic ecosystems through their feeding behavior. Carp are bottom feeders that disturb sediments while foraging, releasing nutrients and suspended particles that increase water turbidity, reduce light penetration, and suppress the aquatic plant growth that native aquatic ecosystems depend on for structure, oxygen production, and habitat. In high-density carp populations, the turbidity effects can eliminate native aquatic vegetation entirely, transforming clear, plant-rich water bodies into turbid, low-diversity environments that support reduced native fish diversity and reduced waterbird populations dependent on aquatic plant resources. The transformation is self-reinforcing. Once aquatic plants are eliminated, the sediment disturbance that eliminated them continues without the stabilizing effect of plant root systems, making recovery of the plant community difficult even when carp densities are temporarily reduced. The European rabbit, Oryctolagus cuniculus, introduced to Australia in 1859 initially for hunting purposes, produced an ecological transformation of Australian terrestrial environments that is still ongoing more than a century and a half later. The rabbit's capacity for rapid population growth, females can produce multiple litters per year with multiple offspring per litter. Combined with the absence of evolved predators with the capacity to regulate a grazing mammal of this reproductive rate, produced population explosions that stripped vegetation from enormous areas of Australian landscape. The vegetation loss from rabbit overgrazing destabilized soils, accelerated erosion, reduced the habitat available for native wildlife, and contributed to the decline and extinction of multiple native mammal species that depended on the ground cover and vegetation structure that rabbits consumed. The introduction of the myxoma virus in the 1950s and the calicivirus in the 1990s produced significant population reductions that demonstrated the potential of biological control for rabbit management. But both viruses have been followed by the evolution of resistance in rabbit populations, and current rabbit numbers, while lower than pre-control peaks, remain at levels that continue to impose significant ecological and agricultural damage. Feral cats deserve a position in this accounting that is uncomfortable to acknowledge because domestic cats occupy a uniquely complicated position in human culture, deeply beloved as companions, deeply destructive as invasive predators. Felis catus, the domestic cat, in its feral form represents one of the most damaging invasive predators in island and continental ecosystems worldwide. Feral cats have been implicated in the extinction of multiple island bird, reptile, and small mammal species, and continue to suppress native wildlife populations across Australia, New Zealand, and oceanic islands globally at scales that wildlife managers find alarming. The specific predatory capability of cats in island and isolated ecosystems reproduces the pattern documented with the brown tree snake. Prey communities with no evolutionary history of feline predation pressure showing no appropriate anti-predator responses to cat hunting strategies. Island birds that nest on the ground, that have reduced or no flight capacity, or that have behavioral patterns calibrated to the predators that existed in their evolutionary history rather than the cats introduced by human transportation, are specifically vulnerable. Australia's feral cat population, estimated in the millions, is currently the primary driver of small mammal decline in many Australian ecosystems and represents one of the most significant ongoing conservation management challenges in the country. The Asian carp complex, specifically bighead and silver carp, represents an invasive species situation in North American freshwater systems where the damage potential of species still in the process of expanding their range creates a specific category of urgency. Introduced to aquaculture facilities in the American South in the 1970s and subsequently escaped into river systems following flood events, Asian carp have expanded through large portions of the Mississippi River drainage and are currently at the boundary of the Great Lakes system, 5 interconnected lakes that contain approximately 20% of the world's surface fresh water and support fisheries of enormous economic and ecological value. Asian carp are filter feeders that consume phytoplankton and zooplankton, the base of the aquatic food web, at rates that can restructure the food web from the bottom up, reducing the zooplankton availability that native fish larvae depend on, and potentially altering the productivity of entire river and lake systems. Silver carp have the additional characteristic of leaping from the water when disturbed by boat motors, producing hazardous encounters with boaters and creating a public visibility for the invasive species problem that filter feeding behaviors operating below the water surface do not generate. The fire ant, Solenopsis invicta, extends the invasive species damage profile into the insect realm, where the population dynamics and ecological effects of a highly successful invasive social insect create a different but equally significant category of ecosystem damage. Native to South America, fire ants arrived in the United States in the 1930s through ship ballast soil and have since spread across the American South and into other regions globally. Their impact on native ant communities, which they displace through aggressive competition and direct attack, cascades through the ecosystems in which native ants perform keystone ecological functions, including seed dispersal, soil aeration, and the regulation of other insect populations. The thread running through all of these cases is not complexity or novelty, but repetition, the same basic pattern playing out across different taxa, different ecosystems, and different geographic contexts with the same consistent elements. A species moves beyond the evolutionary context in which its population was regulated. It encounters naive prey communities, naive competitors, and the absence of the predators and parasites that kept it in check. It expands into the ecological space available to it with the full reproductive and competitive capacity that its biology allows. And the ecosystem it enters, which had been calibrated across evolutionary time without this organism's presence, changes in ways that reduce diversity, reduce complexity, and reduce the resilience that ecological diversity provides. The human role in all of this is direct and documented. Every species on this list is where it is because human transportation, human commerce, human deliberate introduction, or human failure to manage the consequences of earlier introductions moved it beyond the boundaries that geography had maintained. The brown tree snake did not navigate to Guam across open ocean. The cane toad did not cross the Pacific. The lionfish did not establish a migration route from the Indo-Pacific to the Caribbean. Human movement carried them all, and human movement continues to carry species across biogeographic boundaries at rates that are accelerating rather than slowing as global trade and travel expand. The practical challenge of addressing invasive species damage is one that conservation managers across the globe are navigating with incomplete resources against a problem that continues to grow. Early detection and rapid response, identifying new invasions before populations become established and self-sustaining, is the intervention point where control is most feasible, but it requires surveillance infrastructure and political will that are not consistently available at the scales the problem demands. Established invasive populations present control challenges that range from difficult to currently insurmountable, and the catalog of successful large-scale eradication programs remains short relative to the catalog of invasions that are ongoing and expanding. The answer to which invasive animals are destroying the planet is, unfortunately, a long list that is getting longer. The cane toad, the brown tree snake, the lionfish, the common carp, the European rabbit, the feral cat, the Asian carp, the fire ant, and dozens of other species not covered in this discussion are all actively reshaping ecosystems in ways that reduce ecological diversity and destabilize systems that millions of years of evolution produced. Understanding them clearly is the prerequisite for addressing them effectively. Which is why this conversation matters, and why the uncomfortable reality that most of these disasters were human-caused is important to state plainly. Not to assign blame without purpose, but because understanding the cause is the beginning of understanding the solution.